All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to our Noisy Reality on December 7th, 2025. Of course, this is the 84th, is the 83rd or 84th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. I guess someone can, is it, do you know off the top of your head, Chuck?
What?
Is what anniversary date are we at? The 84th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor in
Heaven
1941, I
knows I
guess.
don't know math at all.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Anyway, but today we're going to be talking with Chuck Kamps, who is a retired professor emeritus from Maxwell Air Force Base from the Air Force University. Correct, Chuck?
Air Command and Staff College, yes.
Air Command General Staff College. And we're going to talk about a campaign that usually is not dealt with in depth by Americans. This is something that the British tend to talk about in terms of the Malayan campaign of 1941-42, but as we know, is an absolutely essential part of the overall grand offensive that is mounted by the Japanese in the Pacific in 1941. So we're very happy to have Chuck here to talk about this. Take it away, Chuck.
All right. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Uh, what I would like to do here is I'm going to break this into two segments. The first is going to be the background and conduct of the campaign, and the second part will be the alternatives that were actually mooted at the time. Uh, and so we'll have a little break in there. And then afterwards we can have any Q&A. Okay, if everybody can hear me, that's fine. If you can't hear me, then I'll try and make some adjustments here. I'm kind of under the weather and wearing my oxygen in a bit, so we'll see how things go. All right, ready to go. All right, let me put up share. Okay, how do I get this to?
You might want to hit play.
No, I just need to get cover the whole screen.
Yeah, you should have a should be something there that says play the slide or something like that, or play the show. I can't see your controls.
Oh, here, wait a minute. Yeah. Okay, there we go.
There you
Okay.
go.
I guess that's all we're gonna see. Okay. All right. And can we clear out this stuff up at the top?
That is on your end.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. All right. All right. The conquest of Malaya, a foregone conclusion? Question mark. On the 15th of February, 1942, 80,000 British Empire and Commonwealth troops surrendered to the Japanese at Singapore in the greatest defeat in British military history. In a campaign lasting just 70 days, the Japanese 25th Army advanced 400 miles, often against a numerically larger enemy, and shattered the myth of European invincibility in the Far East. My presentation will review the background and course of the campaign, and then suggest alternatives available to the British, which could have mitigated the magnitude of the defeat or possibly fought the Japanese to a draw. The method used in the project was Clausewitzian critical analysis. Okay, let's see if we can get it going. There we go. The 19th century German theorist Karl von Clausewitz devised a method for historical analysis of campaigns, which can be summarized in 3 steps. 1. Determine the relevant facts of the campaign. 2. Determine the cause and effect relationships of those facts. And 3. Develop alternative courses of action using only the intelligence and technology available at that time. Now, although the concept of this is simple, determining the relevant facts and relationships can, of course, be contentious. The point is that students of military history can propose alternatives without putting themselves in the mindset of the actors and without recourse to unavailable intelligence or technology. When the Anglo-Japanese Mutual Defense Treaty was allowed to lapse in 1922, the British had to seriously reconsider the military situation in the Far East. The consensus solution was to build a gigantic naval base at Singapore to accommodate a main battle fleet. Begun in 1929 and opened in 1938, the base and accompanying coastal fortifications cost a staggering £60 million, a massive sum in those days. As the capabilities of air power became apparent, the scheme widened to include building airfields up country to base some 582 aircraft. In theory, Malaya was expected to hold out for 70 days until the arrival of the Royal Navy from home orders. The Singapore base, however, proved to be an illusory solution. Major General Dobby and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Percival, undertook a staff study of Malayan defense and reported to London in late 1937 that the greatest danger lay in an attack against the north unprotected side of the island, and that the Japanese would probably invade northern Malaya during the monsoon, availing themselves of the trunk road network down the peninsula. Dobby was able to procure a little funding for landward defenses on the mainland in Johore, which his successor, General Bond, discontinued. In addition, Percival seems to have forgotten the lessons of this study by the time he became General Officer commanding Malaya in May of 1941. From 1939, the war in Europe and North Africa had the government's attention, and by June 1941, the Far East had dropped to fourth in priority list for materiel, coincident with a revised expectation that Malaya would hold out for 180 days before the arrival of a relieving fleet. Instead of 500 to 600 first-line aircraft, Malaya had to make do with 158 obsolescent planes based throughout the length of the peninsula. Similarly, the Royal Navy stripped its China and East Indies stations, leaving only a handful of cruisers and destroyers at Singapore. The Army, which under the changed situation had to assume the burden of Malayan defense, put only one pre-war regular formation in country, the 12th Indian Brigade, along with the fortress garrison. As the situation in the Far East appeared more menacing with each new act of Japanese aggression, Malaya Command was beefed up with the addition of the 3rd Indian Corps and the 8th Australian Division. As can be seen on this diagram, all 3 divisions were operating with 2 brigades instead of the authorized 3 brigades. In addition, artillery, anti-aircraft, and anti-tank guns were generally at a reduced scale and often not modern pieces. Perhaps the most glaring organizational defect was the complete absence of any armored units. In contrast to the ethnically homogeneous Japanese army, the Commonwealth forces were a mixed lot of British, Australian, Indian, and local troops. The Indians provided the largest contingent, with 37,000 of the 88,000 soldiers. Groomed for combat on the northwest frontier, the Indian Army as a whole was struggling to adapt to motorization, modern signal technology, and a host of other phenomena associated with modern warfare. The Indians who were sent to Malaya were even more handicapped. They were formations which had been milked of experienced officers and NCOs for new units and did not have the benefit of in-theater combat training from veterans, such as their counterparts in North Africa enjoyed. Worse yet, very few had ever even seen a tank, let alone received training in how to stop one. This map shows the dispositions of the British forces along with the locations of both the operational and unoccupied airfields. As can be seen here, the deployment resulting from the need to guard widely separated RAF bases resulted in the scattering of Percival's army over 50,000 square miles of the Malayan Peninsula, equivalent to trying to defend all of England and Wales with 9 brigades. Percival had estimated that over 5 full-size divisions, including 48 infantry battalions, would be necessary to mount an effective defense. In the event, he had to make do with 3 weak divisions with only 31 infantry battalions. Another point of friction existed between the 2 major commanders of Commonwealth forces, Percival in overall command and Gordon Bennett leading the Australian contingent. Both had sterling records in World War I, and Gordon Bennett was the most senior general in the Australian militia at the start of World War II. Percival, on the other hand, made his mark on the staff and was only a temporary lieutenant general, having been a substantive colonel before the war broke out. Gordon Bennett was under orders from his government to preserve the identity of the Australian force and train his men to fight under local conditions. Percival, on the other hand, failed to enforce jungle training and thought that the building of field fortifications was bad for morale. Gordon Bennett's dealings with Percival were, quote, devoid of harmony. In the 11th hour, Churchill sent Admiral Tom Phillips, named commander of the, quote, Far East Fleet, end quote, to Malaya with the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. These were as a deterrent to further Japanese moves in Southeast Asia. Far from the originally conceived battle fleet, which would reinforce Malaya, these 2 capital ships could only be viewed as a gesture, and a weak one at that. On 2 December 1941, the ships arrived at Singapore, ready to do battle under the designation Force Z. The aircraft carrier Indomitable, which was to accompany them, had run aground in Jamaica and was unable to make the deployment. Its absence would be sorely felt in the days ahead. Now, the Japanese Imperial Guard Division had a triangular organization of 3 infantry regiments and was equipped with motorized transport. Its 3rd Guards Regiment had only one of its 3 battalions present. The 5th Division also had motorized transport and was organized as a square division with 2 brigades of 2 regiments each. The 18th Division was also a square division, but its 124th Regiment was detached for the Borneo invasion. The division used horse transport. The 56th was a new division held in reserve, and Yamashita, or pronounce it better, Yamashita, decided he did not need it for the operation. The 3rd Tank Group mustered 79 medium and 100 light tanks, as well as 238 half-tracks and other vehicles. The 8th, 5th, and 18th Divisions had nearly continuous combat service for 4 years in China, and the Imperial Guard had one, plus occupation duty in Indochina. And here, just a comment, this is one of the few times in history when a general has refused to take extra troops when he's going into combat. He just said, no, I don't need the 56th Division. Yeah, just leave it back. We'll do what we have. And he did it. General Yamashita's force had notable advantages over its opponents. Boldly handled armor and motorized infantry spearheads were normally able to force British positions along the trunk road, especially when assisted by infantry using tracks and estate trails through the rubber plantations to flank the opposition. The infantry really did not have any jungle combat experience at this time, but a study group had issued doctrinal manuals to the soldiers that provided necessary expertise, which most British units lacked. The real secret weapon for the infantry was the bicycle, which provided a cheap and effective mobility advantage behind the line of contact. Aviation was a key factor in which the British badly underestimated the Japanese, predicting that they would not even be up to Italian standards. As they would learn, however, control of the air by the Japanese quickly proved decisive in the Malaya campaign. Japanese Army and Navy air strength outnumbered the RAF by over 3.5 to 1, and most often they flew much better aircraft as well. With mastery of the air, the Japanese could provide support to ground units and perform strategic raids against Singapore City. Although accurate air support was difficult in plantation and jungle areas, the constant presence of Japanese aircraft had an overwhelming psychological effect on the predominantly raw defenders. On the 8th of December 1941, the Japanese made essentially administrative landings at the Siamese ports of Singora and Patani. The British theater commander, Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, had been given authority from London to preempt a Japanese landing when he had reconnaissance indications, but in the event he waffled, and the 11th Indian Division, which had been standing by to advance, was told to dig in instead. A potentially game-changing chance was squandered. Simultaneously, the Japanese assaulted the beaches at Kota Baru and encountered stiff resistance from the 8th Indian Brigade. This operation was almost a disaster for the Japanese, but premature withdrawal by several Indian units allowed them to establish a firm lodgment and push the 8th Brigade inland. In the meantime, Phillips sailed from Singapore with the Prince of Wales, Repulse, and 4 destroyers with intent to sink Japanese transports off Singora. When Force Z was spotted by Japanese patrol aircraft, he turned back towards Singapore. Receiving an inaccurate report that the Japanese were also landing at Kuantan, he altered course to the southwest. Again, Force Z was spotted by the Japanese, and this time attacked by 34 bombers and 51 torpedo bombers of the 22nd Air Flotilla. Phillips had counted on air support from the RAF, but no coordination had been made. Both capital ships were sunk on the afternoon of the 10th, and Britain's fleet and being had been annihilated. Churchill later wrote, quote, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock," end quote. The 11th to the 13th of December saw the Japanese 5th Division crack the 11th Indian Division position at Jitra, which was sited north of the obvious defense line of the Kanawha River. They're, they had it there because they were going to protect the Alor Star airfield, which was not usable. By the time the division reached its fallback position at Gurun, the 15th Indian Brigade had lost 75% of its strength. The battle proved a model of campaign and precipitated a near continuous British retreat down the peninsula. To the east, Procol, a reinforced battalion group, which was to enter Siam and occupy a choke point called the Ledge, ran into opposition from the Siamese constabulary and had to halt short of its objective. Again, the Japanese pressed their attack, and the British fell back. The Japanese custom of killing and abusing prisoners of war quickly got underway as well. The Japanese occupied Penang on the 16th of December, when the Brits demonstrated their unwillingness to stand and defend a major population center. The British evacuation of Europeans there looked suspiciously like racial discrimination to the Asians, and where the Malay and Chinese citizens were once a potential source of irregulars, they now shunned their former rulers and even collaborated with the invader. Even more short-sighted was the British failure to remove or destroy coastal shipping harbored at Penang. During the remainder of the campaign, the Japanese would use amphibious operations on the west coast to try to outflank the British line. During the first week of January, the Japanese broke the British main positions at Trolac and the Slim River. In spite of the stock of 1,400 anti-tank mines available to the 11th Division, only 24 were issued, giving Japanese armor an easy time along the trunk road and plantation tracks, which looped around British roadblocks. The battle was characterized by the same misfortunes that plagued the British from the beginning of the campaign: poor communications, rumor, hastily organized defenses, and bad flank security. Units were surprised, overrun, cut off, and dispersed. On the 8th of January, the 12th and 28th Brigades could only muster 20% of their personnel. General Wavell, the new theater commander, feared the total disintegration of the force and ordered Percival to abandon the major city of Kuala Lumpur and form a line to the south. As the situation on the peninsula disintegrated, the belated British reinforcements arrived in Singapore. Some were replacements for the decimated units already in contact. Almost without exception, these troops were worse than useless, hastily organized and poorly trained, often armed only with rifles. Complete units were also deployed, including 2 raw brigades of the newly formed 17th Indian Division, the remainder of which went to Burma. Like the replacements, they lacked the experience and cohesion needed to retrieve the situation. The inexperienced British 18th Division was also rushed to the theater. Unfortunately, it was organized, trained, and equipped to fight in the deserts of North Africa, and arrived largely in time to go into the prisoner bag when Singapore fell. Gordon Bennett, whose Australians had not yet been committed, was ordered to delay the Japanese near Gama with a mixed force, including the 9th Indian Division and the newly arrived 45th Indian Brigade. Unconvinced of Japanese invincibility, he organized a carefully planned ambush, which was executed by the 2nd 30th Australian Battalion when the Japanese crossed the Gamanta Bridge on 15 January. The action cost the Japanese Imperial Guard Division 700 dead, while the Australians suffered only 8 killed in action and 80 wounded. The small victory was marred by almost immediately when the Japanese were able to find the flanks of the 45th Indian Brigade, which was surrounded and unable to fight through to friendly lines. With characteristic savagery, the Japanese butchered many of the surviving prisoners of war. On the 20th of January, Wavell visited Singapore and instructed Percival to hold on to southern Johor as long as possible and prepare to defend the island. He hit the roof when he discovered that previous instructions to begin fortifying the north shore of Singapore had been ignored by Percival. Percival's command fell back in the face of mounting Japanese pressure. During the retreat, the 22nd Indian Brigade was cut off and destroyed. Overall, the retrograde down the peninsula had cost the British the equivalent of more than 4 complete brigades. On 31 January, the last British troops crossed the Johor Causeway to Singapore, protected by the rear guard of the 2nd Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. The end on Singapore was a mere 2 weeks later. Troops struggled to try to scrape out of field fortifications, lay in commo wire, and prepare fields of fire. The evening of the 7th of February, the Imperial Guard launched a feint against Pulau Ubin, which confirmed to Percival that the attack would come from the northeast. The real attack came the next night against the thinly held positions of the 22nd Australian Brigade in the northwest by the 5th and 18th Divisions. This was followed up the next night by the Imperial Guard Division in the Causeway sector. Although the initial Japanese landings at night suffered serious casualties, British artillery coordination and commo broke down and the Australians withdrew. Except for the recent arrivals, Percival's 13 brigades were seriously depleted. Yamashita, whose supply position was precarious, decided on a bold gamble and ordered an all-out attack. He desperately needed to avoid being bogged down in urban combat in Singapore City itself. Percival ended up with little choice. The civilian population on the island had swelled to twice its pre-war size with refugees. In that situation, once the Japanese had seized the reservoirs, a humanitarian disaster loomed. The surrender took place on the 15th of February, and the Allied soldiers had to look forward to 3.5 years of misery in Japanese POW camps or working on the Burma Railway. For the British, the campaign had been a consummate disaster with very few redeeming moments. For the Japanese, it was an amazingly brilliant victory, marred by the barbaric conduct of their troops toward POWs and civilians. After the war, both Yamashita and Nishimura, who was the Imperial Guards commander, would pay for the war crimes with their lives. Trying not to be too tangential here, but in the aftermath of the campaign, things went to hell. I'm sure most of you have seen the bridge on the River Kwai, complete with well-fed extras working on the Burma Railroad, but it wasn't all like that. Take the case of 65 nurses of the 2nd 13th Australian General Hospital who were evacuated by ship as Singapore was falling. The Japanese bombed and sank the vessel, but among the survivors were 22 of the young ladies on a lifeboat that came ashore on Japanese held territory. Their captors raped them, then ordered them into the surf, machine gunned them, and walked off. One 26-year-old Australian nurse survived with a bullet wound that was missed her vital organs and crawled up on the beach into the jungle. She was captured later by the Japanese and thrown into a POW camp. She survived the war and was liberated in 1945. Okay, that is my once over of the campaign. I'd like to take a few minutes off now here. You can all regain your breath, and then we'll go into the options portion. So, how about taking 10?
Fine, fine, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Excellent presentation, Chuck. Particularly, I can see how much work you had to do to put that all together. Very impressive. Any comments by anybody about this campaign? James, I see you're unmuted. Or Joe or Mike or Brandon?
Well, I guess I'll chime in. I mean, I have a bunch of questions for him,
Yeah,
but I
well,
want to give
give Chuck a little bit. Go on, Michael.
No, it's um I guess the comments the facts I would bring up is that one, the war didn't start with Pearl Harbor, it did for the Americans, but it was because December 8th is on the other side of the international date line. The British, actually the Indian forces, were attacked prior to Pearl Harbor. I think an hour and a half before in real time, and that'd be one point. The other point was, of course, Admiral Phillips' dismissal of anti-aircraft guns um, aboard the dismissal of um, additional anti-aircraft weaponry aboard the Prince of Wales, against the advice of Admiral Tovey, who had led the sinking, the chase and sinking of the Bismarck, who recommended that that British warships have more anti-aircraft guns, and that might have led to, I don't know if it would have prevented the disaster, but it certainly might have mitigated it or caused much more losses on the Japanese side. And the other point is, yeah, I think, and that's what I was going to ask him later, but I think the idea of equipment, what type of equipment and what type of supplies and what type of logistics were available, is pivotal. I mean, it, he made that point, and I think it's a good point to make. Troop numbers themselves don't tell the whole story.
Hmm. Any other comments?
And when he comes back, I was always under the impression that the majority of the tanks Japanese used there were light tanks. And he showed us a picture of a Type 97, which is a medium tank, which is not a terrible tank, but those light tanks didn't have a lot of firepower. So that's one of the things I'm going to ask him.
Oh, okay. Uh, any other comments people have to make? Well, one thing I want to add is that we were talking before Chuck began the presentation. This campaign, uh, to me, is always one of the most important campaigns to understand and study because of its political impact afterwards in terms of Asia in general. Uh, People know that the Indian National Army was essentially recruited from the POWs of this campaign, the Indian POWs, and that the whole example of defeating European power so decisively was one that uh, had an impact on a certain type of nationalism that one has to see in terms of the decolonization movement in Asia, uh, but also was infusing in the puppet regimes that the Japanese set up. That oversimplifying, perhaps to call them puppet regimes, but the kind of nationalism that they wanted on the co-Eastern prosperity sphere. This was their one of their big headlines that they had beaten and destroyed a imperial white army in 1941-42. So that's one point to make. And second point to make is that the literature on this is quite voluminous. In the email I sent you all, Chuck put a pretty interesting annotated bibliography in the back there. And one of the things you see in some of the literature that we've read over the past 60, 70, 80 years about the campaign is this whole question of where this fits in terms of the situation in the European theater, which changed everything. Because as one knows, if one reads the kind of accounts that go on about the 20s and 30s as they developed Singapore as a naval base and how they're intending to deal with the threat of the Japanese, the demands of the war in Europe obviously changed everything. And Michael brings up the question of the repulse and the Prince of Wales having inadequate AA. That was something true, of course, if you look at how, and Brandon probably knows this better than me because he's much more into naval history than I am. But that's a general problem that existed in this part of the war, 40, 41, 42, in terms of they were learning how to deal with the air threat. And certainly after, this is one example of a very strident example of the problem of sending in capital ships without any kind of air support. A perfect example of what happens because the Japanese sank them so quickly. Um, but this is again, looked on as a decisive change in how the issue of naval arms racing was ever seen. The death of the battleships, and we look at our contemporary situation where people are talking about if there's a war in East Asia again, that the capital ships that we currently organize our forces around, our attack carriers, they can be vulnerable to new technology. Whether that's true or not, we can argue about it. But again, the analogies are made to this situation that existed back in 41, 42, especially with the sinking of the Repulse and the Prince of Wales. I think that does become a big example of that. And then the books, of course, always come out, and then the question of the POWs is again a very, very important one. I attended a conference at Bolt Law School back in the early '90s, which was on the very question of how the Japanese got off the hook in terms of dealing with reparations to POWs. And as we know, that was due to, in part, the Cold War, the San Francisco Treaty, which got them off the hook. But it was a quite profound event because at that point, of course, there were still millions of World War II veterans alive. And there were a whole bunch of veterans, including Australian veterans, who were at this conference who had been POWs. And they were all very much concerned about how they'd been mistreated. And it was an amazing 3-day conference just talking about the necessity to change this. And they never, of course, succeeded because no one's going to alter the San Francisco Treaty. But anyway, that issue lingered on into the 50th anniversary period of this of looking at World War II, and especially the POWs from this campaign in particular. Anybody else want to make some comments?
If not, I'm ready to start in on our options.
Very good. Let's go.
All right.
Can I just say something?
Yes,
Sure.
Go on, Mr. Gupta.
Yeah, I'm joining from India. I teach history at a college here in Calcutta, and I have a PhD on the Indian Army between 1914 and 1945. So I'd like to ask Professor Kamps if the second Argyll Highlanders in the Malaya campaign, it was led by Colonel Stewart, if I'm not mistaken. And T.R. Mormon says that unit did a much better job of jungle fighting than any of the other British Commonwealth forces. So does he necessarily agree with that? And my second question is about General Gordon Bennett. Did he do his best? Was he a competent commander, or was he simply overwhelmed by circumstances? Or did he botch his job? What is Professor Kamps' opinion?
Okay, I didn't hear those very well. Could you
One,
repeat?
one question was about your opinion about General Bennett.
Yes.
And another question was, Professor Gupta, what battalion were you talking about?
The second Argyll this British unit, the second Argyll, and I'm sorry, I don't quite recall the name. It was led by Colonel Ewan Stewart. This was a unit fighting under the British chain of command in the British Commonwealth chain of command in Burma, in Malaya. And T.R. Mormon says that it did a much better job of jungle fighting.
Did you get that? Did you get that second question? It's the second Argylls. I guess it was one of the British battalions, and it did better in terms of jungle fighting than others. And what's your opinion? And then I think you mentioned an officer commanding it. But what do you know about those issues?
Okay, I'd have to look up some more stuff. I think you're probably talking about the second Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders.
That's right. That's right.
Yes, and their commander was very much an enthusiast about jungle fighting. I'd have to look up some more about that. There is a number of stuff written about that, and I'm sure it's tremendously interesting. But I didn't include it here. But yeah, that was the one British unit that was very interested in finding out how to fight in the jungle. As far as the
General Bennett.
Australians went, Gordon Bennett was following the directions of his government, which was to fight under local conditions, and he was using commentary by Stewart and other people, and conducting ambushes and things. The Australians actually did much better than any of the British units, if that's what we're discussing.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the audio issues.
Don't worry about it. Great to have you with us today. Go on, Chuck.
All right. Options according to Clausewitz. Okay. General Wavell commented in 1941 that Malaya had been asleep for 150 years. He was referring to the lethargic state of the military and civilian authorities, who fostered a spirit of business as usual right up to the fall of Singapore. This incredible sense of non-urgency remains one of the most inconceivable facets of the campaign. The failures of the government and the military seem almost criminally negligent in retrospect. Given the actors, General Percival and Governor Thomas, it's hard to credit that the battle could have gone any other way. According to Clausewitz, however, we can jettison the dead hand of the incompetents and take a fresh look at the available options that were actually suggested at the time. Now, the obvious strategic option, Prime Minister Winston Churchill got only partly right. In order to facilitate cooperation between Governor Thomas and Air Marshal Brooke Popham, he sent a resident minister to Singapore. This was Alfred Duff Cooper, a brilliant politician, war hero, and author, a man of action on the battlefield, in Parliament, or in the bedroom. I can tell you about that later if you want. The problem was the energetic Duff Cooper's terms of reference did not provide any teeth to force rational policy decisions on the stilted military staff or the catatonic bureaucracy. As As was the problem with the operational level, no one with any initiative could budge the mummified upper echelons. Churchill should have given Duff Cooper virtual proconsular powers to direct the war. Lack of unified effort doomed Malaya from the start. Option: Johor Straits defenses. In retrospect, Churchill said he could no more conceive of a fortress without a back door than he could a battleship without a bottom. Nevertheless, the base had been built with seaward defenses only. General Dobby, in his analysis, had recognized the vulnerability offered by the trunk road access from the north, but was largely unsuccessful in arousing interest from authorities in London. Brigadier Ivan Simpson, sent out in mid-1941 as chief engineer for Malaya Command, was similarly unable to convince Percival of the urgency of constructing a backdoor of improved field fortifications on Singapore Island. This opportunity was thrown away when, alternatively, the defenders' capabilities could have been substantially enhanced. Option: round out the divisions. Using the time-honored tenet of two up and one back, the divisions in Malaya should have had 3 brigades each for normal tactical flexibility. Except for the late arriving 18th, they didn't, even allowing for the poorly trained and incompletely equipped 28th Brigade that could be considered part of the 11th Division instead of Corps Reserve. The 8th and 9th Divisions were short. The 20th Indian Brigade went to Iraq in April 1941 instead of joining the 9th Indian Division, and the 23rd Australian Brigade was scattered with battalions at Rabaul, Ambon, and Timor instead of deploying with the 8th Australian Division. Neither brigade was necessary where it actually deployed. On 1 January 1942, the headquarters of the 17th Indian, and that's Indian Division, and its 46th Brigade went to Burma instead of going and joining the 46th and 45th Brigades already in Malaya. The split assured suboptimal performance by the orphaned brigades. Option: jungle training. In a country literally covered by jungle, the lack of command emphasis on jungle training is a mystery. Only keen subordinates who took initiative were ready. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Stewart of the 2nd Argyll and Southern Highlanders established a jungle training program that was used by the 12th Indian Brigade. As Wavell wrote, quote, "If all units in Malaya had been led with the same foresight and imagination, the story of the campaign might have been different," end quote. Fortunately, when Singapore collapsed, Wavell sent Stewart to India to help train units going to fight in Burma. The only other bright spot was Gordon Bennett, who had his officers learn from Stewart and others and pass the training on to the 8th Division. It is no surprise that the Australians did better than their counterparts during the latter stages of the campaign. Option: anti-tank training and obstacles. As both Percival and Heath was the commander of the 3rd Corps, had first-hand experience of tanks on the battlefield in 1940 in France, it is startling that the War Office pamphlets on how to counter armor sat around unopened in bundles at Malaya Command headquarters. On his own initiative, Simpson had Royal Engineers fabricate materials for 375 anti-tank obstacles and dump them along the trunk road at likely areas up to 70 miles north of Kuala Lumpur. He also mass-produced a simple booklet for use of obstacles and anti-tank procedures. Characteristically, Percival refused to sign the cover letter for the booklet, and no instructions were forwarded on emplacement of obstacles. Given the success of Commonwealth forces when they could mount a serious anti-tank defense, such as the picture of Sergeant Parsons, I had a couple of slides earlier, had command attention been paid to anti-tank operations, Japanese armor could have been stopped in its tracks. Option: improve beach defenses. Before coming to Malaya, Brigadier Simpson had been chief engineer for Scottish Command during the Sea Lion invasion scare. He recommended that a landing exercise be conducted at Kota Baru to detect beach defense weaknesses there and at other likely invasion locations. In addition, he recommended that tubular scaffolding placed underwater on Singapore's south side as landing obstacles be installed on the north undefended shore instead. Both ideas were rejected out of hand by Percival, who apparently paid no attention to anti-invasion techniques being employed in Britain. Had these two simple measures been implemented, the Japanese landing at Kota Baru might have gone from a close-run thing to an outright failure, and the assault on Singapore would have been more costly. Option: 50 RAF Spitfires. One of the decisive points of the campaign was reached in the first few days when the Japanese gained mastery of the air from the second-rate British air arm. At the 1 January 1942 Chiefs of Staff meeting in London, Malaya was up to second priority, and plans were proposed to send 8 fighter and 10 light bomber and torpedo squadrons to Singapore. In the event, only 51 Hurricanes in crates and 24 pilots offloaded at Singapore on 13 January. It hardly got into action when they were withdrawn to the Netherlands East Indies, the last leaving on 9 February. At any time during 1941, or even after the start of the Japanese attack, 50 first-line Spitfires with Battle of Britain veteran pilots could have gone to Malaya to help cover the beleaguered troops. In fact, any of the 676 British aircraft sent to Russia during 1941 would have been welcome in Malaya. Option: systematic airfield destruction. The absence of planned RAF armada that was supposed to protect Malaya upcountry provided bases that were a distinct liability because they were usable only by the Japanese when captured. In the event, no cratering measures were taken at the 7 major air bases which had hard runways, and facilities destruction was at most fields not sufficient to keep the Japanese from making the bases operationally ready within 24 hours. This was another lost opportunity for employment of the Royal Engineers and would have cost the Japanese time and engineering efforts, which in the actual campaign were used to enhance mobility on the march south instead. Option: Operation Matador. In August 1941, Air Marshal Brooke Popham had submitted a plan to London to preempt anticipated Japanese landings at Singora and Patani with 2 divisions. When reinforcements for the original plan were denied, Percival's staff adjusted it to use the weak 11th Indian Division and a task group based on Crow. Brooke Popham had been given authority to execute Operation Matador without reference to London if the Japanese precipitated hostilities or warnings were unambiguous. When RAF Recce spotted the Japanese invasion forces, They could only have been going to invade Siam or Malaya. This was not enough for Brooke Popham, and he did not order Matador, giving the Japanese a free landing. Had the operation been executed, the Japanese would have had a rougher time and had to resort to taking Siamese airfields to establish air superiority over northern Malaya. Option: Royal Engineers operations. Throughout the campaign and the pre-war period, Royal Engineers were marginalized by the colonial government, which wanted a business as usual policy to maximize tin and rubber exports, and by Malaya Command, which held the collective position that overt defensive preparations were bad for morale. It apparently did not occur to either of these that unless Malaya was successfully defended, there would be no more tin or rubber exports at all. Brigadier Simpson was excluded from instituting command-wide programs to hire native labor at competitive wages to build defensive positions at pre-surveyed locations upcountry. In addition, once hostilities commenced, divisional engineers were often excluded from preparing bridge demolitions until it was too late. In some, the Royal Engineers could have made things much more difficult for the Japanese. Option: Gal force increased. In a campaign noteworthy for a lack of British imagination, there were small successes when irregular units, such as the 1st Independent Company and Rose Force, were employed against Japanese rear areas. On the other hand, the use of indigenous peoples was another case of too little, too late. The active force Malay Regiment consisted of only 2 battalions. The mixed European and native Federated Malay States Volunteer Force and Straits Settlement Volunteer Force were not mobilized until the 11th hour, so as not to upset the economy. Lieutenant Colonel J.D. Daly of the Federated Malay States Police established a guerrilla unit known as Dao Force, which enlisted Chinese of all classes, and subsequently became the backbone of the resistance in Malaya. Even Percival noted that this resource should have been leveraged much earlier and to a larger extent. Option: submarines on intercept on the west coast. The Japanese used shipping captured at Penang for amphibious moves down the west coast of Malaya. Had the British not retreated so rapidly, the Japanese may well have cut them off from Singapore. Churchill was furious with the Royal Navy and Wavell's ABDA command for failing to stop Japanese convoys, which, except for daylight air cover, were completely unescorted. At the very least, there were 3 Dutch submarines available to Wavell's ABDA command, which could have been employed immediately in this role. Considering the good record that the Dutch subs had against Japanese transports in the Singora area, it should have been an obvious move to use them. Option: 7th Armored Brigade. In spite of every lesson from the beginning of World War II, Malaya Command had no tanks at the beginning of hostilities. This deficiency might have been belatedly corrected. The 1 January 1942 Chiefs of Staff meeting in London approved the transfer of the veteran 7th Armored Brigade from the Mediterranean Theater to the Far East. The brigade, with 150 Stuart tanks, could have arrived in Singapore as early as 21 February, too late for the historical battle. In the event, it was diverted to Burma, where it did yeoman service during the retreat of British forces northward toward India. Had other options discussed here bought some time, the Desert Rats could have neutralized Japanese armor while there was action still on the peninsula. Option, 1st Australian Corps. Another move ordered at the 1 January 1942 Chiefs of Staff meeting and sanctioned by the Australian government was the transfer of the 1st Australian Corps from the Mediterranean to the Far East. Originally destined for Singapore, the Corps' 6th and 7th Australian Divisions were reloaded on smaller vessels in India and subsequently landed at Colombo, Ceylon, before further deployment. Again, had further options bought the requisite time, the 7th Division could have arrived in Singapore over the period of the 27th of February to the 7th of March, with the 6th Division following during the remainder of the month. These two divisions were well-equipped combat veterans that would have provided a cohesive fighting force to Malaya Command. Option, the missing carrier. The last item I'll mention involved pure dumb luck. The newly commissioned aircraft carrier Indomitable grounded off Jamaica on 3 November 1941. Although repairs were made, she deployed too late to the Indian Ocean, leaving Force Z without its planned air cover. As coordination with the RAF had been fumbled, Phillips' battle wagons ended up meat on the table for Japanese torpedo planes and bombers. The only cure in this case would have been to substitute another carrier for Indomitable. Since the Royal Navy thought it was important enough to send a carrier in the first place, alternatively, they could have sent HMS Victorious, which at the time was on Denmark Strait patrol with the home fleet. This, of course, would not guarantee success, but would have given Phillips an improved chance. If a number of the preceding options actually bought time for the British in Malaya, other factors were at work. In the first week of April 42, Admiral Nagumo sortied into the Indian Ocean with 5 of the 6 carriers of the original Pearl Harbor raiding force, and while achieving dismal results against British bases in Ceylon, managed to sink 1 old carrier, 2 cruisers, 1 destroyer, and 23 merchant ships. This was 6 weeks after the fall of Singapore and could have played havoc with British attempts to keep Malaya reinforced and supplied if the campaign had lasted longer. In addition, both sides would have had fewer land forces to pursue operations elsewhere, as Japanese units from Malaya were historically used in Burma, and British units diverted to Malaya in this analysis historically went to Burma or New Guinea. One thing is that history is done and immutable. Given the actors and the situation, the result probably would have been the same. The German General Staff used studies like these to simply sharpen the skills of their officers to think through situations with an eye toward alternatives. The options presented here are not hindsight, but were bona fide courses of action recommended by responsible authorities at the time with a good chance of being executed. In Malaya, probably all of the options would have had to have been exercised to change the course of the campaign, and all other things being equal, may not have produced anything better than a draw. War game it yourself, and you make the call. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Very provocative. Um, and I'm going to start it off. Everybody, please jump in. One thing I can see right away is the issue of the Navy, of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which you sort of end this with. But I don't think the aircraft carrier, if there had been an aircraft carrier providing support for the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, given the effectiveness of the Japanese air arm in that area of operations, they would have just been sunk as well. And to me, that becomes a real problem in thinking through these different options. Now, the option you talk about jungle warfare, about training the units. That's something that's always struck me. And I wonder how much one can see that as sort of an arrogance on the part of the British, just underestimating the Japanese, or what, sort of the kind of things that we hear in the descriptions of how people didn't think that their pilots could fly right because they were cross-eyed or some stupid stuff like that. And and I'm just wondering, thinking it through, the jungle warfare issue, that's a sort of doctrinal rigidity that comes into play, that we see repeated throughout, military history, and certainly World War II is replete with examples of that. But, I'm just curious your comment about the Navy and then this question about institutional flexibility in the light of meeting new threats, which that jungle warfare issue raises.
Well, number one, with the Indomitable, the thing is at exactly the same time that we're talking about is Nagumo's carrier fleet was doing Pearl Harbor.
Right.
So Indomitable wouldn't be faced with any Japanese carriers. They might have gotten in there and launched a good surprise against the transports going into northern Malaya. Yeah. Other than that, yeah, they'd probably been sunk, uh, just like the battle cruiser and the battleship were. So I that's a given situation. Um, the other the other point that you brought up, yeah, there was um, a lot of bad thinking that went into most European and American um, analysis of how the Japanese would fight. Um, Again, they were very wow, how do I want to say it? They didn't give them all that they were due, and and I mean this was this was really stupid. They didn't pay any attention to performance of planes like the Zero. They didn't pay any attention to the fact that the Japanese used drop tanks and we didn't. It's just not thinking very well.
Yeah, it's always amazed me the initial mistakes and underestimations of the Japanese, which one could, I mean, frankly, part of it could be attributed to racism. On the other hand, that intermingles with the question of the uh, rigidity again of some types of military thinking in terms of how to imagine dealing with the enemy. But anyway, Michael, go on, Mike.
Yeah. Well, first of all, um, it amazes me that my first question would be, why did, or what was Percival's reasoning for not signing off on those documents? Um, but that's one question. Um, I would also posit the idea that, well, first of all, that the Americans also suffered from the same type of, shall we say, misguided thinking as the British, as far as the Japanese. But once Force Z was eliminated, um, again at that point it was really a foregone conclusion, because the British had no chance of resupply, basically had no chance of resupply, or at least that's what an analysis would have given them. The rest of the Royal Navy was tied up in the European theater, because in the Atlantic and European theater, and the Mediterranean, because the Americans were not ready yet to provide any substantial force. So um, uh, I would posit that the British sent what they could, and it wasn't enough, and therefore, wouldn't you say it was a foregone conclusion at that point, at the elimination of Force Z, because the Japanese could resupply, of course, regardless of the vulnerabilities of Yamashita's force. And another question would be the treatment um, of Indian troops. In other words, the um, brutal treatment of Indian POWs as well as British and Australian. Uh, would that, I mean, as far as the Japanese thinking, they eventually intended to invade India, and they knew they would be fighting Indian troops all along the invasion route. Wouldn't that have been counterproductive? Now, as it turns out, yeah, once you kill them and you take prisoners of war, it takes time for the stories of those atrocities to come out. But wouldn't that have been counterproductive to the uh, Japanese idea of a co-prosperity sphere?
It's good.
I don't think they cared.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good answer. Yep. So, and you think that when you say that the elimination of Force Z was was basically the end of the story, that was the nail in the coffin.
Oh, what about it?
That the elimination of Force Z would have been the nail in the coffin because there was no chance of resupply, of sending more RAF aircraft or additional troops or supplies.
Much so.
Right. And so why did Percival not sign off on those documents?
I was a moron.
Any other possible explanation?
Not that I can think of. I
Okay.
mean, what are you going to do when you have a commander who says that any building of fortifications is going to be bad for morale? I mean, that tells you everything right there.
And that was his only the only reasons that he gave for not signing off on those.
Oh yeah, for everything. There's several things that I cited in there where his reason was, yeah, it's bad for morale. And his entire staff reiterated that.
Mm.
Again, they were thinking the wrong way. They were still thinking, oh, the Japanese are little buck-toothed guys who can't see straight and wouldn't have any chance against European troops. I mean, yeah, that was a heavy thought process there.
All right.
Right.
Yeah, if I could pitch in along the same lines, and you implied it but didn't go into great depth. The Japanese at this point, they're very experienced. I mean, they've been fighting since 1937. I'm not sure, you know, even the guys who fought in Europe, it's not the same style of fighting. The Japanese have been trained to do a certain thing, and they do it very well. You mentioned medium tanks, Type 95, I believe. I looked it up. They only had 36 Type 95. They had over 130 light tanks, and they use those, and they use them very effectively. The one operation I'm familiar with is they did a night attack with tanks right down the road, rode through the Commonwealth, and then came back. I mean, that's unheard of. That wasn't being done in Europe. And so these guys are really good, and the problem they're going to have is they're going to run out of them. So I guess there's no question there, just basically an observation.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Mr. Gupta, don't be shy. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about all this. Brandon, go on, Brandon. I think you wanted to say something.
Well, look, Mr. Gupta is a professor. He ranks me, so let him talk first if he
No, no,
wants.
that's all right. He'll join us. Go on, Brandon.
Well, okay. I know I have a a number of things to say, some of which might annoy Chuck, but we'll start with the sea power stuff, which is an area I have big ego about. Let's put it that way. I would say if the carrier had been there, the greatest advantage it might have given would be to have a brain on that carrier, which, if it was listened to, would have maybe cautioned against getting in range of that air power, assuming that they were briefed and aware of that special attack squadron, the torpedo squadron, which was not just an average. These weren't just Nels or um, that happened to wander out over the water and torpedo something. They were highly trained, specifically
You're breaking up,
for
Brandon.
the mission, that they were handed on a silver platter because there was no air cover. I don't. Can you hear me?
Got it.
All right. So if the carrier had been there, and the admiral or captain on it had, Phillips had listened to him, perhaps they wouldn't have lost those ships. But I think had it got to, had the carrier just been along when those two ships were
Huge problem.
sunk, sooner or later the carrier probably will. We will never know. I mean, obviously it's a hypothetical, but maybe taking a whole lot to at least broken up we're able to pretty much do a absolute by the book sort of hammer and anvil kind of attack. And they had three waves of them. Actually, the old battle cruiser did very well for a long time in avoiding the torpedoes. And another parenthetical thing, when you get into this whole thing about they needed more anti-aircraft, what people don't understand is that the Prince of Wales, one of the hits it took from a torpedo revealed a fatal flaw in the design. It knocked out all the power to their state-of-the-art 5.25 anti-aircraft batteries, which were the centerpiece of the entire anti-aircraft defense. So all of a sudden they have these big, heavy turrets that are supposed to have electric power driving them. And they're not really meant, or they weren't really trained to do it manually. They were defenseless at that point. And that was after like the first or second torpedo hit on the Prince of Wales. But anyway, getting past all that minutia, the question I ask here is whether, I mean, it's fine to say Percival was a moron, but if you make a lot of parallels between, if you study, and Chuck probably's done this, parallels between what the Americans versus the Japanese were like in the Philippines and with the British here in Malaysia, a lot of it is very similar and it doesn't go well. And the Americans look even worse, I think, in comparison because they had enormous uh, more resources committed there. But I think in both cases, priority said that these were tripwire forces, that they really never were gonna win. Now, I know if you apply clauses to say, could they have done it better? Could they have delayed Yamashita longer? But I really quite the idea of putting 50 Spitfires out there at this point in the war, I just think that was politically a non-starter. I'll let somebody else talk now.
I agree with you pretty much all the way along the line. Although the thing about the Spitfires, that was proposed by people who are smarter than me. All the rest of what you said, I agree with.
All right. Um, any other comments, Brandon?
No, I'll chime in after somebody else has a chance to
All
talk. I
right.
think I've said enough.
Well, and I do think those propositions are very stimulating, Chuck, to debate and argue. But Mr. Gupta, you were going to unmute there for a moment.
Yeah. So, Professor Kamps, I remember reading something by Raymond Callahan a long time back, in which he wrote that this jungle fighting thing in Malaya was slightly overrated because Malaya had the best roads in the empire outside of the UK. And most of the time, the Japanese troops were simply driving down the road. The hooks they made through the jungle were shallow hooks. They were not very deep hooks. Whereas there was a great deal of more jungle fighting in Burma. It came into the picture more in Burma. So would you comment on that? Could you please comment on that? Is Raymond Callahan right? Or would you say that it was the lack of capacity for jungle fighting that undid the British Commonwealth defense in Burma?
Okay, if I can determine what it was that you said, yeah, the road system was definitely to the advantage of the Japanese, and also the tracks that would go through the plantations that they could go around and flank people. The Brits were not really clever enough to have good flank defense, so so they ended up getting surrounded in a lot of cases. And yeah, the main roads, just like General Dobby had said, the main trunk road system that went down there was very much to the advantage of the Japanese.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Raymond Callahan. Um, I haven't talked to him in a couple of years. I talked to him before the pandemic, and I think he was still teaching at the University of Delaware. I think he was down there, but he'd be very interesting to have because I know he has worked on this subject. Um, but yeah, I put my email in the chat. Is your first name? What's your first name, Mr. Gupta?
My name is Siddharth Das Gupta.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, it'd be very interesting. All of us would be very interested to hear discussions about the Indian Army. Seriously, it'd be really interesting to hear these kind of discussions. You're more than welcome to come and talk about any kind of subject you want about the Indian Army in World War II. We'd find it really great.
Thank you very much.
Uh,
I have a question for right now for him and Chuck,
Go
which
on.
is what if the resources that we're proposing should have or could have been deployed to defend Singapore were instead sent to Rangoon? Would that have been a better use of them for the overall Allied war effort?
What do you
Don't
think?
know. Can't say.
What do you think, Mr. Gupta?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was to be. I don't think it would have made a difference. The Japanese were so superior, I don't think any investment of additional resources would have made a difference. In fact, I think Chinese nationalist troops were far better than British Commonwealth forces. I mean, they fought better, at least for the first few years. The Japanese feared Chinese nationalist forces more than they feared British Commonwealth forces. So I don't think reinforcing Burma with additional material or additional capabilities would have made a difference. But my opinion of this is very, very sketchy. I haven't looked at Malaya. I've only looked at Burma. So I'm really not the best person to answer this question.
Yeah, Burma is an interesting theater of operations. I had a professor who was an OSS officer in Burma many years ago, Roger Hilsman. He was a OSS advisor with the Kachins in Burma.
Yeah.
And
I think I've heard it. Yeah.
and it's a very and the other issue is sort of interesting that I was raising beforehand was I was wondering if you could comment about the question of the Indian prisoners and the whole INA issue, because that to me is also something fast. I've listened to people talk about this now for 60 years. Um, but is it not true that most of the troops that were recruited in to form the INA were from those POWs from the Malayan campaign? Is that accurate?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. There were some civilians from the Indian communities in Southeast Asia, but most of the troops came from the surrendered Indian units.
Interesting.
So there was this huge surrender ceremony in Singapore, where I think there was an officer named Colonel Hunt of the Malaya Command, who handed over these Indian forces to the Japanese. So a lot of the Indian troops who were present there felt let down. They thought they were being abandoned by their British officers, and a lot of British officers also concurred that what happened should have been managed a bit more gracefully. So yes, that is correct. That is substantially correct. That a very substantial number of INA troops were surrendered Indian Air Force personnel, including the 3 officers who were later put on trial and who were acquitted. That became a very celebrated case. Prem Kumar Seghal, Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, and Shah Nawaz Khan. So they were put on trial by the British. They were charged with waging war against the King Emperor, and it was the most famous of the INA war crime trials. And ultimately, they were acquitted. I mean, they were cashiered and dismissed from the British Indian Army, but they were not convicted of waging war against the King Emperor.
Yes,
That was a very celebrated case.
absolutely, a very famous case. Michael, go on, Michael. You had a comment? Mike?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, I do agree that that we should get Professor Gupta to give a talk because of what subsequently happened with Indian troops in the certainly under General Slim was I thought well, he may feel that Chinese troops did better, but I thought Indian troops did exceedingly well in the latter part of the war. But as far as a question, first of all, a comment since Chuck, you brought up the bridge on the River Kwai, which was never meant to be a typical example of British POWs under the Japanese, but the film, at least the more accurate part, would be the William Holden part. His experiences as a prisoner, and then the sabotage raid by Force 316, which is, of course, derived from Force 136. And that leads to the question of the idea that the British did learn from what happened in Singapore. Certainly, Wingate, he didn't even have to learn from that. He already knew what to do and was preparing stuff with the Chindits, but operations such as those. So I would say that in other words, at least the British, wouldn't you say that the British did learn from what happened and in Singapore and put that into effect eventually, certainly in the latter part of the war, put that to good effect against the Japanese post-Singapore? And I also wanted to ask if you thought that that the Japanese attack on Malaya and subsequently in Southeast Asia was more of a priority for the Japanese war plan than the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that's my opinion, but I wanted to know what you would think of that.
Well, as you know, they were all interrelated, but go on, Chuck. First Chuck, then Professor Gupta.
I don't know. The strategy of the thing was pretty, yeah. Their attack against Pearl Harbor was essentially for operational reasons. The attack against Southeast Asia was the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, whatever it was. They really wanted to have those materials. So yeah, I guess it depends on which level you're looking at. The Pearl Harbor one being a more operational, and the South Asian one being more strategic.
What do you think?
Certainly, Yamamoto didn't think that Pearl Harbor was going to end up being strategic. He thought that was a loser strategically.
What do you think, Mr. Gupta?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
Yeah.
Was it about? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go on, Mike.
Well, I'll repeat it. Wouldn't that the Japanese attack, the Japanese operations in Malaysia and subsequently in all of Southeast Asia, would have been of a higher priority to, even though, yes, Jim is right, they're all interrelated, but that the Pearl Harbor attack was simply to mitigate any detriment to the Japanese attacks in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, especially considering the resources that were available there. So it's a matter of which one was the most important to the Japanese.
I see. Well, I'm not completely certain about this. I would assume that the Japanese Southeast Asia offensive would have been a priority, but for them, the most important theater clearly was China. I mean, there were 200 divisions deployed there. So I think their war effort in Asia was very, very China-centric. Obviously, the Pearl Harbor attack had a different dimension. It was an attempt to break the economic shackles that the Western powers were putting around them. So in a way, you can say that the Pearl Harbor and the Southeast Asian operation are linked. They are part of the same plan. It's to break the economic shackles that are being imposed on Japan by the British and Americans. But I would have assumed that for Japan, the really important theater and the key of the war effort, the heart of the Japanese war effort was in China. It wasn't either Pearl Harbor or Southeast Asia. That was where the best Japanese divisions were deployed. And I do happen to think that Chiang Kai-shek got a very bad press. I know this is a very heretical opinion because Chiang Kai-shek has become some kind of a metaphor for political and military dysfunctionality. But I think that this is one war leader who contributed more than any other to the eventual Allied victory in World War II. And I don't think his contribution has been adequately recognized. I know this is a bit of a slightly heretical opinion. It's not held very widely, but I do believe it's the Chinese war effort and the China theater that needs a lot of our attention. I think that is where some of the most important events in World War II were happening.
Well, I agree with that. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I tend to agree. Yeah. Well, hold on a second, Brandon. The issue of the China theater is one where I know that when we were doing these discussions during the pandemic, we actually started to deal with the China theater in detail because it still is relatively terra incognita to most historians in terms of our knowledge of it. Certainly nothing, we don't have a David Glantz for the China theater that we do with, let's say, the Eastern Front. I know Rana Matter did a very good book. He's now at Harvard. He was at Oxford. Now he's at Harvard. And it was a really good look at that. But the other issue with Chiang Kai-shek that you raise is that I know his latest book about how the Chinese Communist regime in the present time has now glommed in to the nationalist war effort, which of course they were had an uneasy alliance with during the war and were opposed to the nationalist regime, but now they become part of the overall effort of the Chinese to win the war, which of course is accurate, but nevertheless, the question of the kind of quality of the army and the nature of the fighting in China and how that interrelates to the rest of the war is something that is still cloudy. I've looked at the Japanese monographs that were done, that were essentially translations and accounts by Japanese officers about the fighting in China, and they actually do not answer any questions of any kind of sizable notion. Obviously, Operation Ichigo in 1944 is very important. And it's really too bad we don't have Ted Cook here because then we could, drop all the Japanese questions on Ted. But there's a really interesting questions to talk about. One thing I always am interested in is there was a really interesting book that was done by a scholar named Hausner. You may be familiar with it. It's called India and Axis Strategy. And what it talks about is the importance of India and how the Germans were looking at joint operations to take India with the Japanese, and that never really got off the ground in a lot of ways. It's a very to me it's a very interesting issue, and then it gets into the whole politics of what's going on in India at the time, which is another sort of separate issue. Which again, to the American general audience, not to a specialized audience like this, but to a general audience in the United States, their knowledge about internal politics inside India during World War II is rather limited to watching the movie Gandhi, if that. So it's a but these are all very critical issues to try to discern. Joe, you're going to jump in, Joe?
Yeah, just quickly on Chiang Kai-shek. I mean, he may personally have been a decent human being, but he was surrounded by corruption. Everybody in his family was corrupt. I mean, that that the euphemism or whatever at the time was what they didn't call him Chiang Kai-shek. It was cash my check. So he may personally have been square, but his army and the people who were fighting with him were not. And that's the problem. And I really take exception to the idea that, he tied down a million Japanese troops. Yeah, they're there. Where are they going to eat? The one place they can eat is in China. They send their troops to Burma, they starve. They send their troops to the Pacific, they starve. China is the one place where they can survive. I mean, I have so difficult to understand why people want to make Chiang Kai-shek out to be a war hero. He spent most of the war fighting the Soviets, fighting the Chinese communists, and he only stopped fighting them when he got kidnapped. He was a strange individual.
Well, that's before the war. That's before Pearl Harbor when he's quote kidnapped. But no,
Yeah, 37 is the war. I mean, a lot of
right,
people
right, right,
believe the
right,
war
right.
doesn't start
Right,
till we get bombed.
but there's no doubt that when you look at the Japanese decision making in the period leading to Pearl Harbor, that's why it's it's so it would be fun to have Ted here with us today. They're debating, well, should we go north? Should we accept the Army's point of view and then knock out the Soviets and shift north? But then they decide to go south. And the question of China always remains a vital aspect of their grand strategy, which I would agree with on that. Go on, Brandon.
It's not vital. It's what the Professor Good said. It's central. If you were to draw a map of World War II from the Chinese perspective, from the Japanese perspective, China would be in the middle of the map. And that's what we need is somebody to do a presentation that shows the people that wanted to go conquer Australia and were constantly doing this, expanding the defensive perimeter. We know Yamamoto's name, but yeah, the Japanese Naval Command, which was fighting a totally different war from the Army, uh, they were looking at the Pacific and all of that. But the whole problem with the Japanese war effort, well, there's a million problems with it, but one very big one was the Army and the Navy had totally different priorities and rarely cooperated unless the emperor forced them to. So, when we talk about this, there's kind of two answers. But what I would just say is what we really do need to do is get someone to present to us Japan's war from the point of view of the Japanese army as opposed to
Uh,
what we constantly hear about and what I constantly read. I mean, we get the tail and the dog confused, in my opinion.
well, those are good points. I mean, I don't particularly get much from listening to what goes on down in New Orleans
One
because
other quick thing,
uh,
responding to Joe, which Joe, with all due respect, Chiang Kai-shek was physically brave earlier in the war. He would go to, the hot spots in the war where he could have got himself killed. And people rallied around him and the resistance was greater. He was not a paper tiger. Now, we could be talking about Ukraine today, but yeah, the corruption is there, but the corruption is hardly the whole story, and it just comes down to which things you want to foreground.
Okay, just quick response. Don't forget, when he opens the dikes on the Yellow River, he kills over 500,000 of his own people. I mean, this
Oh
is
no, I know,
right.
but do you blame that on him or the Japanese? I mean,
uh,
it really.
You
it
can't blame
gets
that on the
pretty
Japanese. He
gray.
tried to do that. He did try to blame it on the Japanese. He had to eventually admit that he opened the dice.
Well,
Oh, he
it is interesting.
did.
Yeah. Go on, Brandon. Go on. Sorry. Go on, Brandon.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
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 go ahead.
please, please, please. Finish your thoughts.
I'm not saying that he had, but I mean, he was fighting a war for survival. Okay. So it's certainly not a decision I could ever see myself making or, justify, but that was an effective way to slow the Japanese down.
Well, I think the whole idea of what happened in China in the war is something that um, I do believe it's important to have a better and more sophisticated understanding about. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, my understanding is based, I've read as much as I can in English, and I've certainly been around friends of mine who write and speak and can uh, communicate in Chinese. I mean, I've had friends of mine for 50, 60 years who've gotten doctorates in Chinese history and politics in 20th century. So I've listened to them talk, but there's lots of questions that come up in terms of what they have to say. For example, one thing I remember coming across in the Amerasia papers. Are you guys familiar with that whole thing? That was one of the big FBI raids at the end of World War II. They raid a magazine called the Amerasia magazine or Amerasia Institute, and they come off with all these papers because they're trying to accuse them of like stealing secrets. And so eventually in the 70s, this all the stuff that they got was published. And it was a big data dump of all these reports from John Stewart's service and all these other guys who eventually get pilloried during the McCarthy period. But it was basically the estimates and strength of the Nationalist Army fighting against the Japanese. And it raises lots of interesting questions about okay, so where's this data down in the National Archives that deals with how they were actually estimating the effectiveness of the Chinese Nationalist Army. And what you see is this big hodgepodge of warlords, of all this force structure that had evolved ever since the Kuomintang decided to forcibly unite with Soviet aid, China, and then everything we know that happens subsequently after that, with this repression of the Chinese Communist Party, and then the civil war that occurs in China. But boom, the Japanese invade in 37, so everything changes. And again, our knowledge about that in terms of the English, language part of it is pretty poor, really. So anyway, that's just something to throw out. Well, what are you going to say, Mr. Gupta? You wanted to jump in there?
No, no, I just wanted to ask, are there any English language sources on the Sino-Japanese war in China which are available to foreign researchers? Is there anything in English at all? I just want to ask. I mean,
You
I
mean
know nothing about it.
there's translations of the nationalist history of the war was translated a long time ago. And that is interesting, but then you have to take that with a grain of salt. In other words, this was the Kuomintang um, analysis. Now, I know in Japanese, the Japanese official history of the war in China is extremely good, from what I understand. But that's sort of, I wouldn't call that a modern military history the way we look on it. And then in English, there is in the Green Book series, there are several volumes that deal with the question you raised earlier about the whole nature of the uh, American aid to China. I think there's several volumes that deal with Stilwell's mission to China. Um, Part of what you're hearing here is that, a lot of people were influenced by Barbara Tuchman's book
Right.
on Stilwell, and that essentially tore Chiang Kai-shek apart. It
Right.
essentially,
But Richard Frank took a totally different tone on him more recently.
that's
And
right.
we know who Richard Frank is here. So,
Right, right, right. Now, Richard Frank, actually, I know Richard
so I
Frank
mean,
quite
different
well.
historians have radically different points of view.
Right. But I think, Mr. Gupta, the question of Rana Matter's book is a pretty good book, but we have other people we work with who are very knowledgeable about this. Like there's one Chinese American who is associated with us, Ed Chen, and that's all he does. He basically concentrates. He speaks fluent Chinese and reads it, so he concentrates on uh, and sifting nationalist accounts versus communist accounts about what happened in the war itself. He's pretty good about that, but it's
He's
not.
also redoing the maps.
Yeah, he redoes the maps, and but again, it's a big mystery. Admittedly, it because when we were doing what we were thinking, what I'm going to probably restart again is what we were doing when we were looking at the strategic conferences of World War II. And I think we're going to start with Casablanca because that's where we left off when actually, when Putin invaded Ukraine, we shifted our gears to cover that. But I think that that this is something interesting to throw in the mix. The people who were knowledgeable about Pacific War history, one person, unfortunately, he's dead, John Prados, because John was interested in all this stuff. John was very much interested in the question of China and world in the war, and So I would have to say that in terms of um, the kind of things you're raising, I don't know how much work is being done on that at this point, to be honest with you, in the United States, in terms of the academy. And then, I mean, I have a good relationship with the Weatherhead Institute at Columbia University, and I don't know anybody there working on World War II issues at all. Um, so it's a really interesting question, man. It really is. Where are you based in India?
Oh, I'm in Calcutta.
Calcutta. And how'd you find out about this through the World War II uh, scholars?
No, I keep getting mails from you for a
Oh, you
long
do?
time.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
been
By the way,
going
I
on for
don't,
quite some
Jim.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Well, it's great. It's great to have you come, man. As I say, it's great to have you here. Um, because
Jim, you might not have heard, Brandon's not on your mailing list. If you could add him.
I will, Brandon. Um, no, it'd be interesting. The role of the Indian Army is essential in the fighting in Asia and in World War II, of course.
There's a very
And
good book by Peter Ward Fay on the Indian National Army. The
I know.
Forgotten Army.
Oh yeah.
That's a good that's a good book. That's
No, no.
really good.
There used to be a professor at Columbia who did a book on the INA. And so he was there forever. He actually did his dissertation on the INA. So I knew that guy. That's a subject that is very interesting to talk about, but at the
There's
same
an
time,
American author who's written Joyce Libra, Japanese Trained Armies and Jungle Alliances. She has
she's
something.
she's very good too. I don't know. She's long retired though. She's out. I think she was at the University of Hawaii. I don't even know she's alive anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. I read her books a long time back.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
I contacted her in the 90s. And so, and there were a lot more people alive than back then. But she actually had done something on the Philippines too. So she was very interesting to me because I was trying to find out more about the practicalities of what happened in the areas that the Japanese occupied. I wanted to get a better sense of the politics of all the areas the Japanese occupied. And that included Indonesia, that included the Philippines, and that included China, of course. So I don't know. I mean, the it's an interesting question because again, 50 years ago, there were still in let's say I'm talking now about Columbia University, there were at least 4 or 5 professors who were uh, World War II veterans who were teaching classes about this kind of stuff. They're dead, of course. They're dead and retired, or I'm sure they're all dead. And one of them had actually been in China in 1937. Her name was Dorothy Borg. And so she would organize conferences like this. She once organized a conference on Pearl Harbor, which was done in 1972. So that kind of interest in the subject matter, I don't think exists the same way it did 30 or 40 years ago.
Well,
Uh, but
Jim, let me just chime in and say, as far as Indian forces fighting against the Japanese, there are a couple of good books that have come out lately, and
oh
and
yeah,
several, of course, Robert Lacey's book. which more greatly gave greater emphasis to the, and justifiably so, to the Indian troops in Slim's 14th Army for one, and also fighting in the fighting retreat prior to that. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there on that. Not as much about China, but there is a lot of stuff in Chinese, and of course there have been films
Exactly.
that have detailed the
Yeah,
war in China from China. Yeah.
exactly. And you're talking to somebody who's actually read the Indian official histories of World War II. So I started to read them back in the 70s and 60s, the different books that had been published by the Indian Army about World War II. Um, but yes, the issue of China.
I have those. I'm sorry, I have those volumes. I have some of those volumes.
Oh
Sorry
yeah,
to interrupt.
yeah, no, please, please. But yeah, and they're very good. They're very good. They're a good base to start with. There's no doubt about it. But like all these official histories, they're jump off points. They're written in a certain period of time. They're written with a certain mentality. They're written with a certain point of view, and one can, rely on them to a certain extent. But then one has to look and see what they include and what they exclude. And that's where I think it's interesting to see the new work that's been done on all these different armies. Now, the Chinese are very interesting to look at during the war. Again, of course, everything disappears after, look, I knew the person who was the U.S. Well, actually, he was the CIA most informed individual on the People's Liberation Army. His name was William Whitson. He did a book called The Chinese High Command. He was basically based in Taiwan in the 1950s, and that's all he did was study the PLA. So his book, Chinese High Command, but it's a book about the PLA through the revolution and into the post-war period and how the PLA set up. It has nothing to do with the modern PLA, but it's a good book to discuss, to look at the actual People's Liberation Army during World War II. I'm pretty sure you can find it online if you go to the pirate websites like Anna's Archive, uh, William Whitson. It's the Chinese High Command. It's a very detailed history of every single PLA army. I'm not down to core level. And of course it was influenced by us fighting in the Korean War against the Chinese army. Um, but yeah, like the campaigns in Burma. So what in particular have you focused in on your work on the Indian Army or the Burma campaign?
Oh, the two campaigns in Burma. The first campaign in which they are driven out, and the second campaign in which they go back and take Burma.
Oh, so you've done,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Well,
It's
that's
actually on the Indian Army between 1914 and 1945. So there's the first two chapters are on Mesopotamia in World War One. Then there's the small war that they fight with the Afghans, the Third Anglo-Afghan War,
right.
and then there are two chapters on Burma. So it's about 30 years.
Well, if if you ever want to talk, if you want to actually talk about that and present, that'd be great. It'd be very interesting to listen to it.
Thank you
Uh,
very much. This has been a great conversation. Very
it'd
stimulating.
be very interesting to hear that discussion. Um,
Well
because
said.
but it'd also be interesting. There's a rich aspect of going into how India evolves during World War II. There's all these different strands of what happens, which to me are always fascinating as all hell. And yes, it's indeed important to people understand.
My supervisor has published a lot on this. Kaushik Roy, he is at Jadavpur University. You may have read some of his books.
Which books has he done?
He has done books on the Indian Army. He has done books on the Japanese, the Indian Army that fought the Japanese.
Oh, Roy. Oh, that's who you work. Oh, yeah, I know. Oh, I know his work. I know his work. Yep, I know his work. Yeah, yeah. No, well, all that to me is absolutely essential for people to understand. And admittedly, it's something that we have less of an understanding about. So it's really great that you were able decide to come on. What time is it in India right now?
Oh, it's a bit late. It's 1:30 in the morning.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Okay. So we kept
No,
you
no,
up
but it's
late, man.
worth it. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we
Thank
kept you up late. Well, we usually try to do these things earlier in the day to deal with our colleagues in the UK. And so I think we
No,
had
no,
one or two guys. We had one or two guys from the UK here today because this is more of a UK kind of thing. They always say, "Oh, these Americans talking about the Malayan campaign," you know. But no, we're interested in that stuff. And the Burma campaign, absolutely. There's all sorts of interesting things to explore with the Burma campaign, and also, all everything that goes on in Southeast Asia. Equally interesting. Because one thing that I've always wanted to do a talk on what happens in Vietnam in 1945, which is to me very important. That sets the stage for everything that happens after that. But anyway, listen, uh, I got to actually get ready to go to a party. So, so I want to thank everybody and thank you so much. I left my email in there so you can communicate with me directly. But yeah, it was great to see you guys and everybody have a good evening and, get a good night's sleep, Mr. Gupta.
thank you very much.
All right. Take it easy. Bye
Good
bye.
night.
Great being here.
Have a drink for me.
Yeah. Have a drink for you. Right. Take it easy.